Off. Yeah, we're gonna record the panel section, but then when we get to the discussion, just to let everyone know, we'll turn off the recording. So welcome everyone. This is actually our third CAC convening for the year. So happy to see everyone. So happy to see some new faces. So welcome everybody. Quickly wanted to first thank Forefront for helping us run the logistics and get us all together. I also wanted to, before we do a full kickoff, acknowledge our CAC co-chair, Mark, from Lohengrin, for his support and leadership. Mark, did you want to add anything before we get started?
Just good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. All right, so before we start the conversation, just want to lay out some context for why we're here together. So as many as you know, we've been actively organizing ourselves to get to know each other and our funding priorities from institution to institution, as well as understand the arts learning and engagement landscape in Chicago and what the needs are during this time. So in April, we convened for a working session to map out our work and understand each other's priorities and giving support. So we're actually putting together a database that we'll be sharing out among the CAC members. And we're hearing from those on the ground in our field to better understand what the needs are during this time. So in June, the last meeting, we heard from Nicole from Ingenuity and Cesar from the Department of Arts Education, CPS, about their work implementing the Arts Ed Plan 2.0, the challenges and opportunities ahead. And we really had a great conversation and discussion afterwards. So I sent out a follow-up email kind of, which had the recording if you didn't have a time to look at it, as well as some notes, but there were some themes that kept coming up. The first was around workforce development, particularly around teaching artists and ways to support their work. Second was defining what high quality is, making sure that the definition was flexible enough to reflect the real diversity of programs around Chicago, different contexts and different capacities of different programs. We were also looking at the implications of exploring supporting arts education through different lenses, through education, through workforce, or as it's what its priority is going to be needed. And then lastly, delivery and pedagogy. Students receive arts education in different settings, both in and out of school. So that really leads us to our conversation today with our three programs. So today we have the pleasure to be joined by three extraordinary leaders in Chicago, whose organizations are the models in each of their own ways of arts learning engagement for young people in the city. Today, we're going to be starting off with the panel conversation. Then afterwards, probably around 3:05-ish, we'll transition to just a funder-only space to kind of debrief what we heard and discuss what's coming up next. But again, we'll stop the recording after the panel finishes. So to kick us off, our conversation is going to be moderated by Kate Lorenz. She's been supporting our work over the past year, really starting with um, that survey that we did last year to understand each other's work. And then we've been having a whole process really learning from each other. She's a consultant who practices supporting mid and small arts organizations and social sector organizations, along with philanthropic institutions. Her work cross boundaries, but centers on organizational development planning, strategic planning, leadership support, and facilitation. So she's been working with us the last year. She brings deep subject matter expertise in the discussions, having spent 13 years as the Hyde Park Art Center's executive director, helping launch arts education programming for Southside teens, and leading its transformation to a fully community-supported tuition-free visual arts school for youth and adults. Kate, do you want to introduce our panelists and kick off the conversation?
Absolutely. Am I muted? It's my pleasure to be here, and it's my really, really great pleasure to introduce who we all know are among the heroes of our sector, three really extraordinary leaders, starting with Natalie Butler, who's the Chief Program Officer at the People's Music School. Many of you know People's Music School, but it's a model organization of intensive music education that's 100% tuition free, serving more than 800 students each year. Has partner sites both at its home base in Uptown, but also in Albany Park, Greater South Side, back of the yards. Natalie moved to Chicago from Miami and spent 13 years as a music teacher within Chicago Public Schools, so knows that world and work extremely well, and has spent the last 13 years at People's Music School, currently as the Chief Program Officer. She's the lead in developing their really extraordinary curriculum, overseeing a robust professional development program for their 70 to 75 teaching artists, is kind of accountable for their really high quality program strategy and delivery. And I know proudly brings a teacher perspective to all her work and continues to conduct and practice in that way. It's also important to say that she's trained and continues to train and perform as a clarinetist and vocalist, if I'm correct on that, Natalie. And we're deeply, deeply honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Can't wait to jump into the conversation. Devon VanHouten-Maldonado, thank you so much for joining us. Devon is the executive director of Sky Art, which is a 25-year-old art and community organization that supports young people through visual arts, culinary, and creative mental health programs. Founded by an art therapist in South Chicago and now has 2 studio sites. It's original in South Chicago and a relatively new space on the West Side, but also works through many partner organizations, schools, juvenile justice facilities, and more. It works with teaching artists, creative therapists, and clinical interns. Has a kind of hybrid model of art therapy and arts training. Devon moved to Chicago from Mexico City, primarily to work with Sky Art and their juvenile justice program. He's a Renaissance man, if you get to know him. He was working as an art journalist, practicing artist, has a BFA himself. Has a radio show that he'll drop in the chat so we can all hear it on Friday nights, and a small consultancy, and has been executive director of Sky Art for the past 3 years. He also has an MA in social sector leadership and nonprofit management from the University of Chicago's Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. That was a mouthful. Devon, delighted to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, we're joined by the esteemed Akilah Halley, who is executive director of Marwen, which I know many of you know. Similarly, a tuition-free visual arts program that serves primarily 6th through 12th graders across 1,200 plus enrollments each year in really high quality studio training, paid summer internships, college prep and readiness, and other opportunities. I know Akilah just got back from Falling Waters in Pennsylvania, where Marwen hosted a residency for young artists at Frank Lloyd Wright's facility, which is pretty extraordinary. Akilah has a really special relationship with Marwen. Prior to being executive director, assuming that role in 2018, she was a member of the board of directors for a number of years. And not so long before that was an alum of the program herself. So has truly seen and been a leader at the organization through a lot of different lenses. Akilah, thank you for being here. We're delighted to jump into the conversation. I'll say before I'm going to stop sharing, and Kanitha has spotlighted our participants so we can hopefully shine the light on them. We're going to get started with a conversation with a few caveats and also a little bit of kind of instruction for all of you listening. One, we're so delighted and honored to be joined by these 3 remarkable leaders, 3 very model organizations, to hear their kind of lived experience and perspective on a number of the issues that you all have been discussing as a group. And we know that the field is really diverse and expansive, and we don't expect these 3 to speak on behalf of the entire field, but instead really around their own personal experience and organizational context. Secondly, we'll jump into the conversation. We're going to leave ample time for Q&A from you all in the audience, and we'll open it up for a robust discussion, we hope. But in the meantime, please be dropping your questions and curiosities, even if you have them now that you'd like to hear from our panelists, in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. It'll be a way for us to both track your questions, make sure you don't lose track of them as they come to mind, and also help kind of the moderation as we move through the discussion. So please use the chat liberally to drop your questions, and we'll be sure to come back to all of them. But first, by way of introduction, Natalie, Devon, and Akilah, and maybe Natalie, since you're to my top left, we'll start with you. But I think one thing, getting to know each of you even better, that is really notable is that you are each trained as practicing artists and have spent time in your career as practicing artists. I'm curious if you could share with the group maybe one way that your art practice has influenced your leadership practice at your organization, and if that's trickled down in any way. Natalie, I'll ask you to kick it off if you don't mind.
Sure. I think my artistic practice, even more fundamentally than my personal artistic practice, is sort of my context of what I appreciate in the arts. So I am trained as a classical clarinetist, and I've had some vocal training as well. But prior to that, I come from a context of people who just loved and appreciated the arts. So my father was a professional dancer. I studied dance when I was young. So I have always come at my approach to my time as an educator and now my time as an arts administrator with a deep love and passion and commitment to the arts, and understanding, the transformation it's created in me, and really seeking to make sure that those opportunities to get that kind of transformation exist for my students. I am really a fearless advocate of every little tiny thing that even if it's an inch that I can gain of something for the students that we serve. And really trying to push them to go outside of their comfort zone. So I'm a classically trained clarinetist, but I also continue to teach. I also teach some of the ensembles at People's. And we've had our greatest successes this year in playing an Afro-Cuban mambo piece and in playing blues, right? So continuing to stretch myself and demonstrating to our students that I stretch myself and I'm learning in front of you, and we're going to learn together. And man, the outcomes that I've been able to see the students experience, absolutely incredible. So I think that sort of my desire to be a learner and just a very expansive view, an appreciation of the arts, is something that I try to bring to the work that I do at People's Music School.
Thanks, Natalie. I love that. It sounds like it really influences the standards that you set for the students and for yourself, as well as the desire to continue to stretch your own creativity, which matriculates into the curriculum and students. That's wonderful. Akilah, how about you?
Thank you, Kate and Natalie and Devon. My practice, my kind of artistic practice, has been in the mixed media spaces. And so I think about that as informing kind of my leadership and my approach as, when I look at mixed media and working with different materials, similarly working with different perspectives, and leveraging all of those different perspectives to make one work of art. Recognizing that different perspectives gleans different experiences, different textures, different materials, and the mix of work that I've done with painting and mixed media, with found and saved objects, and with typography, to me is also reflective of how you kind of garner the different voices and opinions and take all of those things into consideration when making a work of art. And then similarly, I've been academically trained in industrial design. And with that has been centered really around understanding behavior. And so I leverage that as a way of informing my leadership style, in the sense of not jumping straight into solutions, taking some pauses and observing, really understanding situations and scenarios, to give that pace and kind of cadence to working towards a problem-solving space versus just jumping straight into solutions. So those are the two ways, both artistically and academically, my art and design background inform the way I show up as executive director now.
Sounds like you're making leading an organization, you realize that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That connection to mixed media is super, super interesting. Forgive the siren in the background. Devon, how about you?
Yeah, thank you all. And I just want to say, first of all, I'm really honored to share space with Natalie and Akilah and Kate. Obviously, Hyde Park Art Center we work closely with. So I feel like the cool younger sibling that was like invited to the party. So just really appreciate being here. I think in terms of creativity, I think about like the difference between making art and being an artist, and how being an artist is it's a mindset. And it's a mindset of iteration and experimentation. And so I think like when you're trained as an artist and you go through art school, you're not afraid to fail. And you'll try things and experiment and iterate. And so I think that kind of iteration and experimentation, of course, makes sense within an arts organization, but also I think makes sense in leadership, to Akilah's point. And I think it turns out that young people for their development also need experimentation, right? It's like that's how they approach their boundaries and figure out, when the world pushes back, and that's what shapes them. And I think, I fear that, especially for young folks, we've created a world without a lot of that pushback and a lot of experimentation. And so I think it's really important to have spaces like ours where young people can experiment, exercise their freedom of choice, fail, try again, and have adults that demonstrate that to them as well. And then I think it's important what we do at Skyard, that we try to like live those same values in the way that we work. So even operationally, fundraising, all of those things, we try to approach from a mindset of, okay, like how can we think differently about fundraising? How can we think differently about operations? How do we, live our values that we teach our young people every day in our programs, and live what we teach within ourselves as a staff. And I think a lot of that just comes back to the mindset of an artist, like with a beginner's mind, as the Buddhists would say, approaching life with curiosity as opposed to fixed answers. And I think, in our age of AI and so many other things, social media, creativity is actually one of the most important skills that we could teach our young people. And we know that unfortunately, oftentimes our public school systems throughout this country don't do a great job of cultivating that creativity, especially in the Black and Brown communities and marginalized communities where we work.
Wonderful. I love that notion of your leadership requiring a healthy appetite for failure or tolerance for that possibility. It's a really helpful thing to hold on to. So in our prep conversation, Natalie, Devon, and Akilah, we talked about how one of the reasons this group is convening and meeting with each other and interested in is a kind of an acute awareness of the kind of extreme dynamism or instability in the funding and institutional landscape, especially over the past 5 years, kind of post-COVID on. I think we don't need to list all the ways that has manifested in our world, but I do think it'd be really helpful to hear from each of you a little bit about what that looks like at your organization and for you as a leader and for your teams of kind of what the instability has looked like and what the largest impact is for you. Knowing that it's a bit different for each of your organizations. And Akilah, maybe we'll start with you first, and we'll be eager to hear kind of from each of you. And very much appreciate your willingness to be candid here.
Sure. No, thank you. And I appreciate the question and the space to just dive in. I would say that, the way in which it's looked over the past few years, it's, some of it has varied depending on how heavy the pressure has been. One of the big examples is it is challenging, it creates a challenge to growth and evolution of the work, because there isn't necessarily the space to invest in new ideas or thinking about scaling up in certain ways, because you really don't want to diminish or dilute the integrity of the work product that you're um, really profoundly believing in and working towards. And so there is this way in which you just stay within the parameters of just your bread and butter, but perhaps you want a croissant or a bagel on the side, but you can't necessarily tend to those things or begin to harvest some of those ideas because you know that you need to stay within those kind of core parameters. I would say that it also creates some strain on your team, uh, staff morale, team morale, as they are not only navigating a very heavy landscape to live in, it also creates conditions that are harder for them to show up. And, I work with a incredible team of full-time employees, part-time employees, and independent contractors. And for me, being able to support them in their livelihoods is also very important. And so recognizing you want to be able to invest more in them as it pertains to their salary, their benefits, their professional development, things of that nature are also slower to be able to invest in. So it impacts both the programmatic things that you do or aren't able to do, but also investing in the people who are carrying and holding that work. And I think that those are the two large areas where we've seen the biggest impact over the past few years.
Okay, so a little bit of a holding tight, defensive posture, conservative approach to sticking with what you do and being very judicious about new investments, and the kind of real impact on humans doing the work. I heard similar themes from each of you. Devon, I wonder if you want to just piggyback on that, because I know that's something that we talked about in our pre-convo too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a strange all over the place 5 years, right? I mean, I think COVID came around and Skyart was well positioned through our social emotional learning centered pedagogy to attract a lot of new donations. And we through COVID opened this Project Impact, which is our art therapy program, and really formalized a lot of our therapeutic work. I think essentially there was a couple $1 trillion pumped into the economy with the Inflation Reduction Act. And that money, trickled down to individuals, to organizations. I think, if you were an organization who was able to pivot during those acute years of the pandemic, you could thrive. And I think Skyart, took the opportunity to grow. We'd been investigating an expansion to the west side since 2019, but we were able to, capitalize on the growth, purchase a building. But then in 2024, we know what happened, right? And sort of like all this momentum that built up, and in addition to all that inflation that built up, so everything's more expensive. Our budgets all grew, but we're not getting much more for that money. And then all of a sudden, 2024 happens, and I think it's like a couple of things happen. It feels like every funder was reassessing their priorities, and it's like everyone at the same time decided to fund different things. I think there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of valid transitions. Folks are focused on democracy and things that feel really acute right now. Unfortunately, it's always art that is sacrificed, right? The other thing that's really affected Skyart, I think we've taken a step backwards with some of our more progressive social justice causes, as we all know, right? Like, I feel like everyone's forgotten the diversity statement on their website in 2020 that we were all so committed to. And now it's like we all forgot that we made these promises and these commitments. And I mean, we didn't for sure. Like, I don't think the community-based organizations did, but I think certainly a lot of funders and government did. And a way that's showed up for us, unfortunately, is we in the past received a lot of violence prevention funding. So, for example, through the Illinois Department of Health. Yeah, IDHS, Illinois Department of Health. We used to get violence prevention funding for our programs, right? And we really see our programs as preventing violence, because if a young person finds a sense of belonging and connection at an after-school program that they can go to year over year, they're much less likely to become engaged in risky after-school behavior that leads to either being victims or perpetrators of violence. So we 100% see our work as violence prevention. Well, IDHS no longer sees us as violence prevention. So that's a couple $100,000 that were eliminated from our budget. And now, they want to fund what I call violence intervention. And so we're taking some steps backwards, and we hear it in the current administration. We've even heard it from more progressive candidates recently around government taking a step backwards and looking at, crime bills. And it's like we're going back to this like 1990s, 2000s era when the United States was incarcerating 200,000 people a year. And so I think that's actually been a real loss. It's just sort of like um, turn away from the importance of organizations like ours for some of these basic social goods, and just overall the nonprofit industry as not being understood anymore as like a safety net. I think again during COVID there was a lot of appreciation for the work that we do as a community, for our country, for our larger societal good. And unfortunately, now it just feels like that's fallen out of vogue, because of some of the acute challenges politically, socially, economically that folks are facing.
So it sounds like you've really felt a pendulum swing kind of post-COVID investment in some acute ways that kind of similarly impact as Akilah shared at Marwen as well. Natalie, I know you've had some both maybe counter-cyclical things happening and a different version of instability at People's. I wonder if you would share a little bit about the same topic from your perspective at the People's Music School.
Sure, there's so many things in what both of you said that resonated with the experience we've had at People's. Some of the cyclicality as well. So, for us, COVID was challenging on a variety of fronts. We had quite a bit of administrative turnover during the period. And we had a venture that we had done in California briefly with starting a program site there that really emerged, I think, and understandably from the board of thinking, okay, well, we're doing great programming here. There are children in other places who need the work, and there is a source of funding that we could potentially find. And I think that we have learned as an organization that chasing funding in that way is never the right idea, because it has to be core of what we do. There's still hundreds of thousands of children in Chicago that we haven't had the opportunity to serve. And so that experience, created sort of a real negative budgetary impact that has taken us, thankfully, we've gotten out of it, but it was very challenging for us to overcome as an organization, that on top of, the staffing changes. But I think what really stood out to me from what both of you said is talking about like the heaviness of the times and the impact on our staff and then our students and families and the way that we serve them. We serve 95% students of color. We have a very significant population of students who are immigrants. And, we finally felt like we were emerging from all of the challenges and instability of the pandemic to then, going right into the 2024 election and then all those ICE raids. I mean, we're still, summer for us is our look into data, planning time, and we are seeing the real impacts of students and families who didn't feel safe to come out of their homes, needing to have emergency closures of our programming because there are ICE raids happening literal blocks from our program sites. Not to mention the fact that, we have 4 different locations, and 100% of the people who manage those locations are people of color, 75% of whom are, people who are Latino, and we're all, preparing each other, like where do you keep your passport? Where do you keep your, so navigating all of that as an organization, and then needing to then turn around and continue to try, to the point that you made about Skyar, of like holding strong on what our values are, and that we do value diversity. We do have a community code of conduct. We do explicitly state that we want to serve everybody and that we value diversity in our website, in our language, and we don't want to change that. But we recognize that commitment and sort of steadfastness to what we believe means that there are some funding sources that are not as available to us anymore. So really having to, what is it like when they say your NEA grant is, you have to kind of sign a pledge that we're not comfortable signing. We don't want to pledge to give our students information. We don't want to pledge to say that we're not going to serve the community in the way that has been the way we've served them for 50 years. So it's such a delicate balance, while at the same time remembering we've got students and families right now that are present that we're trying to give the very best programming that we can with the limited resources we have. So yeah, I definitely connected with a lot of what you both said.
And I think, Natalie, what you're speaking to is kind of the fundamental pressure cooker that is a role like all of yours, where you are accountable in all directions, to students, to staff, to funders, to the government in some cases, depending on your level of funding. And that it sounds like those pressures really have intensified. And I think maybe I'm also hearing a little bit of unpredictability in all of your experiences. I want to maybe pivot another, as Joe kind of preluded in his context setting. This group has really been hearing from a bunch of different directions around the needs of the creative workforce, we'll call it, those in the arts education and learning environment, which obviously includes you as leaders, your teams and staff, and also teaching artists who are kind of the delivering the programming itself. And would love to hear, and knowing that you each work with teaching artists in slightly different ways, which is probably representative of the field, what you're seeing as the needs of teaching artists and your teams. Have they shifted? What's most pressing at this moment? How are you thinking about what pressures are there to support and provide for kind of the teaching artistry community? And Akilah, maybe I'll jump it back to you since we haven't heard from you in a minute.
Yeah, it's interesting that you just mentioned predictability, because I do think that that is certainly one of the things that we continue to recognize as important coming from our teaching artists, a degree of predictability around opportunities that may exist for them. Certainly the equitable pay that is part of that opportunity that may be for them, so that they can plan their lives accordingly. We talked about how everything is tremendously more expensive for everyone, especially our independent contractors, when it comes to thinking about medical benefits and healthcare. When we think about supplies and transportation to and from the different gigs that they may have across the city and even in the outskirts. So being able to understand kind of what they're signing up for, what they get with what they're signing up for, and that sense of community. I think that with that predictability is the transparency around pay. And some scheduling flexibility. We just were in the midst of our second session of our summer term, and I was talking to a teaching artist this morning, and they had their 9-month-old with them. And I said I was just juggling childcare, but to know that I could just bring my child, wear her around the studio as I'm teaching, that sense of support and community, instead of calling off, missing those hours of pay, having to scramble to get the sub, those sorts of things. I think that the degree of care with that is also really important. I think we all are navigating such heavy times, and it hits people differently. The way in which it really impacts their day to day, but care and consideration around what they may be navigating creates the space to see our ways through it. So I would just say it's, that predictability, clear communication, investment in resources, and care.
Again, you're speaking to both the kind of psychological service, the feeling of feeling supported, which maybe is a bit of a culture that you need to be intentional about nurturing, but then also kind of basic needs, healthcare, childcare, pay, et cetera, kind of two sides of that same coin, which is how we started the conversation. Natalie, how about you?
I think what we hear really strongly from our teaching artists, most of whom come from a background strictly as performing background, so they don't necessarily have training as educators. And so what we hear strongly from them is the skills that they feel that they need to develop to be able to support our students' social and emotional learning needs. A lot of what we've seen coming out of the pandemic and then really surging to the top again with all of the rates that happen in the fall is really significant mental health needs that our students are having. We're having students come in for music lessons and like literally breaking down from the stress that they're feeling, the responsibilities they have to now get themselves to and from programming because a parent doesn't feel safe to bring them because they're afraid of what they might experience on the way. And our teachers wanting to be better and feel better equipped to support students through those sorts of needs, as well as for us, we've seen a real increase, in the 13 years I've been with Peoples, a really significant increase in number of students who have learning, strictly learning needs. And so figuring out how to find those resources to train our staff, who the vast majority of whom are also trained, performance musicians. So to train our staff, to then get the training for our faculty so that everyone feels equipped to actually be able to support our teaching artists in this way. And just trying to be as creative about that as we can be. So, tapping into our personal networks to find people who are educators, case managers, special education teachers who actually can train us, and then we can, and bring those folks in to provide that support. And then continuing to reach out to our teaching artists. So I was literally this afternoon just getting ready for our team meeting agenda on Wednesday, which is where we're going to deep dive and look at the survey results. We ask our teaching artists every year, what do you need? How could you feel better equipped? What are you seeing in the classrooms that those of us who are one or two steps removed from the instructional spaces are not seeing? And then trying to figure out how to get them increased resources. So I think that's something that we're always looking at, but really consistently post-pandemic is the social emotional learning needs of our students, and teaching artists really feeling that we need to better equip them to be successful in working with every student, no matter what kind of presentation that student has when they come for programming.
I think it may be a good segue, Devon, to you, but also want to just maybe ask Natalie and others, like when I hear that, it sounds like a really big ask of a classically trained musician and a music school to be equipped to be a mental health care provider and equipped to teach across every learning style. Talk a little bit about how, where resources come from for that, how you navigate the training and support needed
Absolutely.
for your
So
students.
we've been really lucky to get for several years volunteer social workers who have volunteered specifically to support our staff and faculty. So not necessarily for students and families, and being willing in situations where, like, we have had multiple situations where neighborhood violence has shut our programming down, meaning like students are walking in one door and students are walking out the other side of the building and someone is getting shot. So like very proximate to our programming, and having people who are willing to volunteer their time to support staff and faculty. Really good point that you made, Kate, of we are not asking our classically trained, jazz trained musicians to become therapists, but we're asking them to identify the issues so that we can direct our students and families to resources. And we have other community organizations that we've been able to partner with, who we can then send students and families to get that kind of care that they need. We have two of our sites are school programs. And so that's a really great resource because oftentimes the principals can give us some clues as to, what other community resources are available there. And then just having our personal networks. So for example, one of my closest friends is an incredible educator, special education teacher, case manager. She just volunteered, last week for an hour and just sat with our team to help them understand, okay, you've got a student's IEP. Let's break it down, right? So we're just constantly looking to increase our knowledge base, but also recognizing there are limits to this. We're not nurses, we're not psychiatrists, and we're not asking anyone to do that. But at a baseline, we want people to feel like they have at least a few tools and resources that they can use. And then something also really unique that we do is we do assess every student's IEP and 504 plan that's provided for us, and try to create a one-page plan that's in regular, non-jargon language, that addresses how to help this child in a music classroom. And that's something that we've invested a significant amount of time in learning how to do and creating a process to do that. And it's definitely been helpful. We still always feel like there's more to learn, but that is, some of the ways that we've tried to approach getting this information to our teaching artists so that they feel better equipped to support our students.
Thanks so much, Natalie. I think you're illuminating that arts learning and engagement doesn't happen separately from life and from the rest of the social needs of our city and community. Devon, how about you? What are you hearing at Sky Art from teaching artists? I know you also have creative therapists and clinical interns as well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's such an important point that like we can't be all things for all people. And I think there is a real pressure on community-based organizations to like do too much. And we can't. I mean, Akilah made the point earlier about the pressure that exists on our staff and just sort of like us and all like there's just so many things happening. And I think, community-based organizations, nonprofits that serve a social need are asked to, build the world with a matchstick, and we, and without the resources that are necessary to do those things. And so I think it actually is almost an impossible conundrum. And I think it's like okay to just acknowledge that and say like, hey, we're being asked to do too much with too little. And I think that's kind of like what I come back to. And I think transparency is another piece that Akilah brought up that I think is so important. We actually met like this was like I don't know, when was it, Akilah? It's probably 2021, 22. We met with Marwen and Hyde Park Art Center to talk about our teaching artist pay and say, hey, here's about what we're paying. And we had different structures, but I just think those conversations are super important. To like create some transparency around pay and equitable practices, of course, but also to just be like, hey, let's collaborate. Let's work on this together. There's plenty of resources out there. Like we don't need to have this competition mindset, which I think there's pressure even in that direction to compete for resources and, you know, uh, be at odds with each other, which is just, we so not necessary. So I think that transparency piece is really important. I think when it comes to meeting the needs of teaching artists, certainly providing training is really important. I think it's important, and there's industry pressure from funders to do more all the time, and I think that is actually really important to sort of know what you don't do. So even within our therapy program, we put pretty strict limits on our therapeutic program. So, for example, when young people start expressing suicidal ideation, self-harm, harm of others, we actually refer those cases out because we are not a clinical program in that way. And so it's really important to have really guardrails on all of your programs because, the young people's needs are so acute right now that if you let yourself get pulled down that route, like all of our staff are social workers and they're already dealing with their own stuff, right? And so I think we need to give our staffs permission to not know everything, give ourselves permission to not be able to meet everybody's needs and do the best that we can given the limited resources. Right now, we're looking at transitioning all of our teaching artists to part-time staff. There's a legal framework behind that. That's where the industry is kind of going, and it's going to cost more money. And so I think like there's a real need there for more funding, it can be difficult to get funding for things like employee pay. And all of our teaching artists are going to become employees now, and so that just becomes it further complicates this funding landscape, and then it inevitably costs us more. We're looking at a 15 to 30% increase. And it's like, so do we cut that out of our programs? Where does that come from if we're not getting more funding for those things?
Thanks, Devin. So, kind of an increase, you're speaking to kind of the increased pressure that increased support for teaching artistry puts on your organization and programs. I want to open it up to the group for questions. Joe, I think that others may have questions in the back of your mind that, Joe, I'll invite you to maybe ask the question you dropped in the chat, and then others, please feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, and we'll open it up for questions for the panelists from all of you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for really providing a lot of that context and really from all your lived experience of, I mean, the last 4 years plus of like just kind of this constant instability, a lot of pressures. And I think as a funder, we're trying to figure out how do we support all the different needs, both how do we support the needs of the organization, but also the needs of the students that you're working with. And so we think about at the Fry Foundation, how do we support that? Is it being a stable funder? Do we help you provide more capacity building to address specific issues? I guess I'm changing my question I put in my chat a little bit, but if you're like asking funders like, okay, here's all the needs and here's how we're going to do our programming continuously, how do you approach if there's extra funds, are you directing that toward keeping your program stable? Are you trying to find ways to innovate? Like what is the most helpful, at least from us, that you would think you would need?
Akilah, I think I see
Yeah.
you jumping in.
Yes. Thank you, Joe, for that question. And I would say it's a bit of a number of things. I mean, one, it is a commitment, like a multi-year commitments first, as we think about anything that helps build capacity, and anything that is an investment in an expansion or a new area, for us to explore. A lot of the ways in which we're unable to do that is because when we don't have, the certainty, or again, the theme predictability, in order to plan out how we can start off a pilot and then prepare to grow that. Whether that's an investment in general operating support that fully supports increases for our staff, whether it is, to Devin's point, when we're converting independent contractors to part-time employees, not only is that an increase in the expense that we see as expense, but is actually an investment in the teaching artists who are at the forefront of that artistic instruction. But there's also the investment in the organizational capacity to then almost double your employee base, which then will likely mean that you're putting a strain in another area of your operations. And so it's more so seeing how an investment in one area should equate to an investment in another area, and that it's more than just drop in and drop out, but it's more of a longer term investment, so that it actually creates the sustainability that we all are yearning for in order to do our respective work. And, to Devin's point also, we do work in the spirit of collaboration and learning from each other, and the work that Natalie's doing over at the People's Music School too helps us all inform how we can strengthen our practices, not necessarily to step on the toe of one another, but to work hand in hand with one another. So an investment in one organization is also an investment in the other, which certainly just helps the field overall. Lots of challenges that we're all grappling with, but I think that it's very helpful to see the field support as well.
I would add to that. I mean, I 100% agree with everything you said. I would add to, like, maybe even dive deeper on the capacity building. You know, I've been at People's long enough to see that in the few times where we have had grants that have supported capacity building for staff and faculty, man, after that, it's just incremental. I mean, it's not sorry, not it's exponential growth. It's so much positive impact that I see on our students, because the people who are shaping the program and guiding the program, their knowledge base has grown. So when our knowledge base grows, then what we can offer for our students is so much bigger. But the opportunities that we get to find funding that supports that have been few and far between. But it's so meaningful because every time we've gone through that kind of experience, the organization comes out on much more solid footing, where we run more effectively, whether it's, we've had opportunities to like improve our business practice, to improve, um, the way that we evaluate and assess our staff list. Every time we've gone through those experiences, it makes such a big difference to how well we work as an organization. And so opportunities like that are really, really important. And then to what Devon said earlier on in the conversation, whenever we have the opportunity to do something that's a little experimental, to try something that is off of the central sort of beaten path, but to have the kind of funding that allows us to stretch, those are also the opportunity where something really special opens up for our students. I'm thinking of, grants that allowed us to go from a, completely, analog to like being able to have, digital resources to use with our students. Man, that opened up so much for us. But again, those kind of opportunities are fewer. And if we had more opportunity for funding that would support that kind of work, it would be really, really meaningful to, all kinds of organizations, and the work that we do.
Yeah, I very much agree with everything that my colleague said. I think I want to pick up on what Natalie's saying about this kind of innovation piece. And Joe, you touched on that. I mean, obviously, multi-year gifts, general operating, like that's the best, right? But I also think like beyond the dollars, I think that funders need to demonstrate innovation and encourage innovation. I think about this term isomorphism a lot. And I love this as a theoretical concept. I don't love what it means. Isomorphism was actually first talked about in the for-profit sector. It's this idea that like companies tend to act alike because of pressure. And like, so like over time, like organizations become more similar. And so I think it's like, I think that happens in funding and with organizations. There's all this like pressure to just act like everybody else. And I think funders, tend to be quite risk averse and, like not talk about like technology, right? Like we're living in this like this technological age, and a lot of nonprofits and funders, frankly, are like, not operating in the most high-tech ways. And so I think there's like lots of opportunities for funders to encourage community-based organizations to try new things that are maybe not the most normative within our sector. Like I think the nonprofit industry tends to do things really specific. It's like you hire the consultant to do your strategic plan, and then it's like you with all these steps in our industry, and like many of them are fine, but I think like it would be helpful if funders allowed us to think outside of those things, especially as arts organizations. We're artists, I want us to be able to think and experiment, and to be innovative, we have to be able to break some of those norms. And I do think like through isomorphism, there's a pressure within our industry to like do a lot of the same things in the same way at the same time of year. And I just would love to see funders kind of lead us and encourage us through dollars and just through encouragement and votes of confidence, to try things a little differently and experiment, because Lord knows things are broken, and we can do things differently and have a bigger impact.
Back to the appetite for failure or risk, right back where we started. What other questions are from the group? And feel free to raise a hand or even just unmute yourself and put your voice in the room.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Jana. I'm a board member of SkyArt, and I have a family fund. I'm curious with this sort of a movement that everybody hears about of effective altruism, people less interested in like the legacy benefits from the traditional institutions, names on the walls, like your last name before a job title, things like that. Is that something that are you feeling as a positive movement that it's already coming in a practical way your way, like meaning people that would never look at your cause, at your mission, at your institution, become more interested to hear projects that they may support in the future, or it's just like me dreaming here and that hasn't happened yet?
I think we're seeing a little bit of that, of people who are just finding out about the People's Music School, and maybe it's not their normal areas that they're interested in funding, and being willing to learn more about it. So I don't know if it's necessarily turned into tremendous amount of dollars, but they're coming to our events, they're learning more about our organization. And I think what I find most exciting is when those folks who came in sort of like, oh, the arts isn't that nice, kids singing and playing instruments. And then they come in and see the work and they're like, oh, no, this is actually truly transformational, right? The arts can truly transform a human's experience in a very positive way. I get excited when I see some of those sorts of things. And I would say we're seeing a little bit more of that, um, and would love to continue to see that. But I think a lot of that has come to our organization from being able to tell our story in different ways. And I think that's learning that we've had, is that we have to be able to talk about the amazing things that are happening with our students now and have happened over the last 50 years, but in different ways to speak to different audiences. And we have to build our skill set to be able to explain what we do and explain the impact, in that it is violence prevention, it is an after school experience, it is community building, it is art for art's sake. It's all of these things legitimately when we do our work at the highest quality. So we've gotten a lot better at being able to articulate our story in ways that different audiences will kind of they'll be able to see themselves and their interest in our story. But it's work to do that. We're still building our skill at that, and I think because we've improved at being able to do that, then we're starting to see the kind of people that you're describing, who are willing to go beyond, a plaque on a wall and their sort of niche thing that they want to fund, and being able to see us as something that would be interesting to them to support.
Outcomes driven donors, maybe. Nidra, I see your hand up as well, and we'll open that up for you.
Great, thanks, Kate, and thank you all for being here today. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm fund all of you guys. So I just really appreciate your candidates today. My question was kind of expanding on the capacity and kind of the needs that you touched on for your teaching artists. I mean, one thing I'll just say, it's incredibly brave and resilient to lead a community-based organization at a time like this. And I imagine, or rather, I can't imagine what all of you are facing day to day. I'm just curious if you can share. I'm wondering what do you think your needs are, like as leaders who are leading today, your staff, your teaching artists, thinking about your students. Have you thought about what you need, what leaders like you need in this space, and how funders can support the resiliency and sustainability of you all during this time?
I want to jump in here because it's something I think a lot about, is sort of like almost like the mythology around the executive director. Like I think a lot of that with funding is like the need for so much funding to flow through the executive role, right? Like the expectation that we're out cultivating donors all the time. And like, of course, that's an important part of our job, but it's also not the most sustainable. And so I think like for donors to understand that, like, and support, I mean, maybe it comes back to capacity building of like supporting more of a systemic process and procedures based operational fundraising mechanism that doesn't rely solely on the executive director's relationships. And like frankly, I came into this position without those relationships that some other executives do bring, that sometimes they're familial, right? I think, and I think there is still, I hear it from lots of people all the time. I have Jana's here, but Jana will forgive me for saying, even from like our board, sometimes there's like this pressure to be performing the role of ED when there's all this need from your staff to be supporting them. So I try to resist that pressure to like perform ED and actually focus on what works with fundraising. But again, I think, not to like harp on isomorphism, but I think like sometimes we just do the things because we're told to do them or that's the expectation of doing. And I think like specifically when it comes to fundraising and being an executive, it's like there's so much pressure around that. And then it just is like, so you're out every night going to all these events and you're running your organization. And that's like, it could just really, really burn you out. And actually, in my experience, it doesn't always translate to like a lot of funds coming in. I think we all have different, revenue streams and, SkyArt's not very reliant on individual giving. We certainly want to build that up. I think if you are more reliant on individual giving, it's maybe a different story, but that's something that I think a lot about and kind of like want to push back on all that always is like the idea of the executive as the face of the organization when, you're like actually looking at three organizations that have been around for a really long time. We're the little kid at 25 years old. That means that the organization cannot be represented by a single individual, and that's also resilience.
Yeah, I completely, echo both Natalie's sentiment from earlier as well as what you just shared, Devin, around just, the things that I'm concerned about are just heightened levels of concern for everyone else. There is the way in which an executive director, a leader is always holding everything themselves. And it's the kind of way in which you have to be several steps ahead, which means you're deeper into the stress or trauma that you're navigating. And just like we want that mental health and wellness, for the young people and their families and our staff, we need it for ourselves as well. We can't show up and be our greatest selves if we're not caring for that for ourselves as well. And the operational piece of leading during these times just heightens some of the concerns that already existed pre-COVID. It's just that the conditions in which we're operating in are just heavier or more escalated. So it's pronouncing some of these challenges that have always existed. They're just even more extreme than they've been before. So I think that that's also an important thing to note. But the things that are always top of mind for me are making sure our operations are smooth, which then means I want to make sure that the families, young people and families are cared for, which means the staff needs to be cared for, which then rest upon our shoulders. And that's a pretty hard thing for one person to hold on their own. And I think it was that Center for Effective Philanthropy that said that most EDs are now more concerned about their mental health and wellness compared to everyone else's because of this long stretch of time in which we've been caring for so many. So I think that it's just an important kind of note to reflect and figure out how we can sustainably navigate these times because it's not a moment in time. It's a true investment in time.
Natalie, how about you? I want to give you a chance to answer that really empathetic question from Nidra.
Man, yeah, Akilah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in that it is very heavy responsibility, and you both are executive directors. I'm a chief program officer. I'm not the executive director, so I can only imagine the pressure that is on Miriam Goldberg-Owens, who is our executive director. But as the person who is the sort of nexus of everything programmatic, if there is a problem with any of our 800 students or families or 75 faculty, all of that filters through me. That's a lot. And we deal with, I mean, the number of DCFS calls that I have to make, the situations that I have to navigate, that I then have to help the program managers navigate, who then help the faculty navigate. It's a tremendous amount of responsibility. There's a tremendous sense of pressure. And because the work we do involves human, it's consequential, right? So making the right call at the right time, with, using the right resources to make that call is very, very consequential. It's very meaningful for that one student who, when I heard what he said, meant that I had to call DCFS within 24 hours, right? And that's the work that we do all of the time. It is very draining. And, as I mentioned earlier, this is, planning mode for People's Music School. Every single week, we're having conversations about how to make it more sustainable. What do we need to adjust? How do we need to tweak when we start or end programming or length of programming, or what happens at this site versus that site, to make it so that these incredibly dedicated, so talented individuals who run our programs and the teachers who create these great experiences for students want to stay at the organization. We can't have a revolving door of people, because a revolving door of people does not get great outcomes for our students. We need people who, we talked about earlier, who can be consistent, who persist with our organizations. And so having to create the ability to work in a more sustainable way, and to have funding that understands when we need to make those adjustments, and to have supporters of our organization who understand that, is incredibly important. But it is a tremendous amount of pressure. And it's something that we balance, while at the same time still trying to give great learning experiences, great programmatic experiences, to make great art. We're balancing all of those things, and it's a heavy responsibility, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. It is 3:09. I wonder if we could, we want to thank our panelists, who I think we can agree are heroes in our work, and appreciate your being here. Maybe as you exit and leave for your day, you could each leave us with one sentence, something that gives you hope and that you're excited about, so that we can have that taste in our mouth as we thank you and bid you good day. Akilah, any one thing that gives you hope and that you're excited about?
Yes, you just mentioned that I just returned from Falling Water with a group of young people who were part of an expanded version of our Artward Bound program. And I am profoundly inspired by many things that they shared, that they created and learned during that time. But one of the things that that kind of lifted me up the most was the amount of times I heard a young person say, "And I was so proud of myself." And I feel like I will always be connected to these people and this work. And for me, that was what mattered in the world. That a young person and young people are proud of themselves, and they feel connected to people no matter where they go or no matter where life takes them. So that is what I'm carrying with me.
That's beautiful. How about you, Devon? One sentence of what gives you hope and inspiration.
I have more hope and faith than ever that creativity can change the world.
Love it. How about you,
Period.
Natalie?
I continue to be inspired by all of the students who continue to show up and learn in public and make mistakes in public and create and make incredible music. I mean, some of them are so young and they give their all to it. So the fact that they still continue to show up and that their parents entrust us with them gives me a lot of hope.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so, so much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, so it looks like we're